So here we are again, and thank you for being with us. We have reached a peak of participation of more than 80 participants, so thank you very much. So I'm now launching the Day 1 Panel 2 that will be chaired by Dr. Donato Vozza, who serves as a lecturer in criminal law at the Faculty of Business and Law of the University of Roehampton in London. The panel is focusing on challenges and perspective in countering tax fraud and corruption with a special perspective from the European Union level. Dear Donato, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Costa, and good afternoon or good morning, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this second interesting panel of the VIRTEU International Final Conference. Before introducing the topic and the contributors, let me say, first of all, thank you to the principal investigator of the project, Dr. Costantino Grasso, the co-principal investigator, Dr. Lorenzo Pasculli, and Stephen Holden for their kind invitation to this international conference. Congratulations on this research project, which has developed a significant contribution to improving the knowledge of the interconnections between tax evasion and corruption in the member states and at the European Union level. I'm more than delighted to chair the panel entitled Challenges and Perspective in Countering Tax Fraud and Corruption, the European Union level. Our panel is composed of distinguished contributors with significant experience in this field. Professor Umut Turkcen, a professor in law at the Center for Financial and Corporate Integrity of Coventry University, Dr. Valeria Sico, Italian European Delegated Prosecutor for the European Public Prosecutor's Office, Professor Carlos Weffe, Scientific Coordinator at the International Bureau of Fiscal Documentation, and last but not least, Massimiliano Vincenti, Investigator for the European Anti-Fraud Office of the European Commission in Brussels. I will present each contributor in more detail soon. Each panelist will have around 10 minutes. At the end of all presentations, there will be a question and answer time. To all participants, please remember to write your question in the Q&A interface of Zoom. At the end of the session, we will discuss all the questions. So let me introduce rapidly the first distinguished contributor. Professor Turkcen is professor in law at Coventry. He led the EU-funded project ProTax, where I was a researcher, which focused on the countering tax crime in Europe. And he is currently coordinating another important EU-funded project, TRACE, which aims to create a technological-based solution for tracking illicit financial flows, strictly interrelated both with corruption and tax evasion. Professor Turkcen's presentation is entitled Tax Enforcement Challenges in the European Union. Umut, welcome to our panel, and thanks for presenting this relevant topic. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Donato. I'm going to talk about solutions rather than just challenges, given the limited time I have. So we've come up with a number of toolkits as part of this project. They are designed to help law enforcement agencies responsible for tax offenses and for researchers who want to delve into this under-researched area, and also for policymakers. And accordingly, we made 24 recommendations for different stakeholders responsible for tax ecosystems within the EU and also at the national level. And given that I have 10 minutes time, I've gone through our key findings and recommendations and selected 7 that I would like to focus on. And I'll try to explain why 7. If not, do ask me in the question time. So we have this figure from a study done by the European Union Commission, telling us the tax gap. And you can see some countries have a bigger tax gap than others. However, we are not really clear how much of this gap is created by tax offenses or various types of tax offenses, some of which are not criminal. And also, we don't know how much of it can be attributed to inefficient tax collection. So I want to start. First solution that we need to seek is improving how we collect and collate statistics on tax and tax crimes and also tax gap. Because in our research, we found that each country, if they recorded at all, collect information about, for example, successful convictions of tax criminals in a very different way than others. And some don't even differentiate among different dishonesty offenses, fraud, for example, between a scam that involves different types of tax evasion or tax offenses. So that can create a problem for us researchers. And more importantly, it creates a problem for the European Union Commission, because they are supposed to, for example, to assess the effectiveness of the directive on the financial interest of the European Union in 2023 and whether it has had an impact on, for example, VAT fraud. So if they don't have the correct and reliable statistics that are comparable, they're not going to be able to perform their duty to do that, which is articulated in that directive. The other thing, again, I want to focus on things that are feasible, can practically be done. The other one is user-friendly tax reporting schemes, enabling citizens, taxpayers to report their tax obligations more readily and easily. And there are plenty of research has been done on how technology can aid compliance. I always used in various different platforms the example of Spotify and other music listening and downloading platforms, whereby introducing such technology literally eradicated illegal downloading and copyright issues about music. And similarly, research has been done at public transport where you don't have to buy physical paper ticket, but you can with your credit card or your bank card, you can just touch point as you enter, and that can really ease compliance levels. So this is another example of a solution. It's not always improving the law or having harsher punishments. Sometimes user-friendly technologies can aid compliance, therefore reduce the gap, tax gap. Another thing that was pretty much common across all jurisdictions across Europe we've studied and had face-to-face interactions with is capacity building. And I don't mean just capacity building in terms of expert staff, workload and facilities and all those things, but really what was coming across was that particularly cross-border tax crimes involved very complex data and very complex structures in terms of business structures and how wealth is distributed beyond European jurisdictions. And that information had to be often quickly analyzed so that the criminals are not alerted and the recovery process of the assets subject to taxation or evaded or proceeds of the crime can be done more effectively. And in fact, that idea gave us the idea about the project that Donata mentioned, TRACE, how we can help law enforcement agencies to quickly make sense of the picture of a very complex organized crime and therefore start their investigation much quicker than they would normally do. And then the third issue I like to look at, which again came across from our research, is the thresholds for tax crimes. Each country in Europe, without any exception, criminalizes tax evasion. However, they use very different approaches. Our colleague from Greece explained how the Greek legal system deals with tax offenses. And even in countries where they have traditionally criminalized tax evasion, there hasn't been much also conviction, prosecution and conviction. So we've gone beyond what the law in books tells us, but we looked at law in action. So we need to look at those thresholds, streamline them, and the threshold also applies to the directive I referred to earlier on about VAT fraud. We have the threshold of 10 million euros before the EU authorities have jurisdiction on the issue. And I think I am in the opinion, along with my colleagues, I think Donato would agree, something below 10 million euros could be serious, because it could be just a tip of a smaller scale in one jurisdiction, but it could be a duplicate of the same scheme happening across. So just because we became aware of a 1 million euro scheme doesn't necessarily make it not serious. So the fourth issue, which I really feel passionate about, is this argument in literature. You find that tax crimes are treated as victimless crimes, and yes, everyone is a victim, the society at large. However, I argue that the damage of tax fraud, tax evasion, or anything else you call it, has very identifiable and finite number of victims that are directly related, particularly when a business, a corporation evades tax, because it disadvantages similar businesses in that geographic area or in that sector directly. So similar to anti-competitive practices sanctions, we can really look at the damage that is caused by tax offenses, and that would send a very different message to businesses and improve compliance. I think that was my fifth recommendation or wish, what we can do. The last one, let's call it, which has also been alluded to, we've discovered that a lot of the big tax fraud, tax evasion cases do not surface because of traditional policing and investigation practices. They surface because of investigative journalism or whistleblowers. So going back to the message about improving whistleblower protection is a really key issue that we need to look at, and what the EU has been doing with the Whistleblower Protection Directive is a welcome development. And the last issue is we've always said that enablers play a key role, both committing tax crimes, but also bringing light to malfeasing activity. So the key professionals we identified, they also provide the least number of suspicious activity reports or suspicious transaction reports are accountants and auditors. And the main issue we found is that we don't enable in our legal systems for these entities, these enablers, to truly perform their duties independently of the companies they are supposed to report. So we need to improve the legal regime for enabling these enablers to report purely on an independent basis without having to fear their jobs or their contracts in the future. So those are the main things I'd like to tell everyone, and I'll leave it to questions if you have any questions to ask on those areas.
Thank you very much, Umut, for your fascinating presentation and for providing us food for thought about practical tax enforcement challenges, including issues about the collection of reliable and harmonized statistics on tax offenses, inadequate legal frameworks, weaknesses in the detection of tax offenses due to lack of reports, lack of adequate technological solution, the role of tax professional enablers in organized criminal groups, and the issue of the anti-money laundering regime. So it is also interesting to know that there are a lot of solutions in this area, and there is still a lot of work to be done in the context of the European Union. Now, let me introduce the second distinguished panelist, Dr. Valeria Sico. Valeria obtained a PhD and master in criminal law and procedure. From 2004 to 2021, she held the position of a deputy prosecutor of the tribunals of Nola in Naples. On May 2021, she became an Italian European delegated prosecutor for the European Public Prosecutor's Office. The title of Dr. Sico's presentation will be the EPPO cross-border investigation in VAT fraud. Dr. Sico, welcome to our panel. It is really a pleasure to have you with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Good Good morning, good afternoon to everybody. I'm very glad to participate to this final conference, and I thank Dr. Grasso for inviting me at this conference. I think it's not a case to participate to this conference because talking about the topic of our panel, I think that EPPO, European Public Prosecutor Office, is an attempt to answer to this necessity and the needs to find a solution in VAT fraud and fiscal corruption. I don't know how. What do you know about EPPO, European Public Prosecutor Office? And this is the reason why I try to share my video and present. Okay. Can you see?
Yes, we can see.
Okay. Okay, EPPO, European Public Prosecutor Office, it's a new office, a prosecutorial authority, which started its operation the 1st of June of the last year in 2021. EPPO, it's a very new authority and office because its characteristic is that EPPO, it's a supranational prosecutor office. We are a single office composed by a central level and a decentralized level, and it's composed by 22 member states. We are 120 European delegated prosecutors, and we come from 22 member states country in Europe. But we operate and we work like a single office, and we are independent in internal and external independence because we are independent from EU Commission, EU Parliament, and EU organization in general. But we are independent also in our member states, independent from national authority, especially in prosecutor hierarchy, which is, for example, in Italy, it's a big hierarchy, but we are independent. We don't work for example, Ministry of Justice, but we work for EPPO, the central level, which is located in Luxembourg, and our office are located all over the Europe. You can see the member states that participate to EPPO, and you can see that states which not participate to EPPO is Hungary, Poland, and Sweden. That country that used to participate to criminal cooperation, but not in this kind of cooperation. And we have also Ireland and Denmark, which doesn't participate in criminal cooperation. We are all prosecutor in our country. We work in our country like our colleagues, national prosecutors, but we have a particular competence related to temporal competence, because we are competent only for offenses committed after the 20th of November of 2017, and we have a exclusive competence related to some particular offense. So obviously, we are competent for every kind of criminal offense which is committed in our member states, and we follow the national rules related to competence. But EU regulation, which talks about regulates all the organization of EPPO give us a specific competence related to PIF directive. As you can see, in the same year, 2017, we have the EU regulation and directive, PIF directive, which it's an acronym for protection of financial interests of European budget, and it's our competence is related to every kind of offense that can cause a detrimental in EU budget. We are competent, as you can see from the directive PIF, in expenditure and revenue. On expenditure field, we are competent in non-procurement fraud and procurement fraud, in sense of all kind of fraud, for example, maritime fisheries frauds, agricultural frauds, or also every time European Union give some funds or pay for some procurement, it doesn't matter which is the money that comes from EU, we are competent and we have an exclusive competence, and it means that we exercise our competence and national prosecutor can't investigate on this kind of offense. Obviously, we have also, an important part of our work is related to tax offense. As you can see, VAT is not a direct resource of EU budget. This is the reason why EU decided to give us competence in VAT fraud only when the damage is more than 10 million euro, and it involved not less than 2 member states in EU countries. But we are obviously competent in no VAT revenue, for example, in duties, and we have a direct competence because duty is a direct resource for EU budget, so we can start our investigation as soon as we have the report. Obviously, we are competent also in every many other offenses related to our offenses. For example, we are competent in money laundering when the profits come from the PIF offenses, and we are competent in every kind of corruption, passive and active corruption, following directive meaning, and in misappropriation. Here you can see how does it work, and I give you the time to read the slide, but I want to explain you that when we have a crime report related, for example, VAT fraud, we have the competence to, we exercise the exclusive competence only when we know that we have 2 member states involved. But at the beginning, we have thought that it was very difficult for us to investigate this kind of crime offense. But after almost 1 year of activity, of operation, we are find a lot of case law where we are competent in with exclusive competence, because it depends on the way you make investigation. For example, in Italy, we have a delocalized, decentralized competence. If a tax crime is committed in circumarea of Naples, Neapolitan Prosecutor Office competent, and so on. And Neapolitan Prosecutor Office limit its investigation on the companies which operates and work in this circondario. If he finds a company that operates, for example, in Milan, he split the case and send the other part of the case related to Milano company to Milano prosecutor office. We don't have to do this because we have a national competence. So if I find a connection in tax crime between a Neapolitan companies, companies in Milan and companies in Palermo, I can investigate on these three companies. And if I find that import and export trade is committed with another European country, for example, Bulgaria or Germany, I can investigate on it. But if I need something from Bulgaria or from Germany, I can use a special kind of cooperation that we'll look in a few seconds. This is our statistics related to the annual report that our chief, Laura Corduta Covesi, a European chief, made last March. And you can see I give you the slides in order to understand which is the number of the case. But I think that an important slide is this, because you can see how many kind of case law we have and offense we have till now related to our exclusive competence. And you can see the most of offenses related in non-procurement expenditure fraud. But the second one is what revenue fraud. This means that it's not so difficult for us to investigate in this kind of offense. Almost the damage is more than $10 million, because if you think about the fact that company who makes this kind of offense are a lot of company, not just one, and they operate for several years, it's very easy to achieve the damage of 10,000 million of euro to activate our exclusive competence. I talk about cross-border investigation. What's cross-border investigation? We have a particular instrument, very fast, very effective, that we can use in our investigation. Like a national prosecutor, if I need to investigate and to have any kind of evidence, for example, information, bank account from another country, I need a European investigation order. If I need some information from a third country, I use a rogatory letter. In EPPO, if I need something from the other member states of EPPO, I have to assign a task to my colleagues in Bulgaria, for example, and ask him to search the information that I need to take a bank account, to make a search, to execute a preventive seizure without using normal cooperation instrument. And it's very, very fast, this kind of instrument, because we have a case management system, a data where we put our files.
Sorry, Valeria, just 1 minute, and then it's very interesting, but
yes, of course. So I put everything in the case management system. My colleague who I have seen the measure has the possibility to see in the same laptop entering in the case management system which kind of document I have and which kind of information I need. And he is a specialist, obviously, in his country. He knows his rules, procedural rules, and for him, it's easy to understand which kind of judiciary instrument has to use to obtain the evidence that I asked for. And it's not so easy instrument, but it's easier than European investigation order. As you can see, we have an important percentage of offense in VAT fraud investigation, and we have a lot of cross-border investigation. This statistics is related to last year, the first 6 months of operation of EPPO. So you can imagine now which is the number. And I want to show only this to understand that the damage in general for EU budget is come from VAT fraud for the half part of the damage, as you can see. And it's important to understand this because our instrument is important to counter, to combat this phenomenon. We can use also other partners to investigate all not in member state of EPPO, like Eurojust, OLAF. We have the agreement, a lot of working agreement with this organization, and we have some investigation also in third member states related not only for VAT fraud, obviously, but especially with China. You can imagine that VAT fraud and not VAT revenue fraud, it's the most important part of this investigation.
Thank you very much, Valeria, for your excellent presentation. It was really interesting to learn more about the structure and functioning. And we will have a time to discuss the role of the PPO. After your presentation, we have already some questions in the chat. Now it is my pleasure to introduce the next contributor, Professor Carlos Gueff. Carlos Gueff is the scientific coordinator at the International Bureau of Fiscal Documentation Observatory on the Protection of Taxpayer Rights. He's a tenured associate professor, a former head of the Public Finance Department, a former professor of criminal tax law at the Central University of Venezuela. He has authored 4 books in the area of tax crimes, congratulations, and has published nearly 80 articles and book chapters in this area. His current lines of research are taxpayer rights and the policyfication of tax law. The title of the presentation is A Stormy Relationship, Substantive and Criminological Challenges in the Fight Against Corruption and VAT Fraud. Carlos, welcome to our panel and many thanks. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Donato, and good afternoon, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I am aware of the time constraints we have, so I'll just cut to the chase, so to speak. In a way pretty similar to that used by Professor Turkson, I would like to raise your attention to 2 different types of challenges that from the perspective of tax lawyers, we find when studying the relationship between tax fraud and VAT fraud specifically, and corruption. First of all, we need to set things straight. When dealing with these various numerous concepts that are somewhat strange in the day-to-day operation of tax lawyers, we need to understand what is really meant by relating corruption, bribery, collusion, tax fraud, and money laundering. And the very first concept that comes to mind when dealing with them and assessing them from a tax lawyer perspective is this characteristic of this being predicate, once of them being predicate crimes to the others, namely tax fraud being a predicate crime of money laundering, for example. And that raises the first issue, so to speak. Is this relationship between all of these concepts and the accumulated penalties and the distinguished, the differentiated prosecutions for each and every one of them expanding, for instance, the statute of limitations for persecuting this kind of crimes and increasing penalties in a way that might lead, and that's a warning sign. I'm not saying that this is right or this is wrong. I'm just saying, okay, this is a point we need to put the focus on. Would this lead to an inflation of criminal definitions? Would this lead to problems of proportionality in the first place? Secondly, from a substantive perspective, or a more specific perspective, the relationship between corruption and tax fraud appears to be symbiotic in a way that the one enables the other. Corrupt institutional frameworks relate somehow, that's intuitive in a way, to greater tax fraud, to a greater incidence of tax fraud. And the other way around, tax fraud might lead and may corrupt the regular institutional framework of a country in the sense that tax fraud is, and particularly VAT fraud, is directly linked to organized crime. And from a tax law perspective, then it raises the issue of the pecunia non olet principle on how is this illegal activity, and how are the proceeds of illegal activity, and how are bribes related to tax fraud and related to commercial activities be treated from tax purposes? Are the expenses, quote unquote, on bribery to be taxed or not, or are to be recognized as deductible? There are differences, but mostly the approach seems to be to the denial and I'm repeating myself, in denial, so to speak, of the pecunia non olet principle, which is one of the fundamental principles, on the other hand, of tax law. From a regulatory perspective, Professor Turkson mentioned it a few moments ago. And Donato actually mentioned it in his presentation, the extraterritorial prosecution and enforcement regulations on a criminal level at the EU is a very well developed system that is not matched from the tax perspective by the tax regulations that may complement and that enhance the system. And this might have to be somehow with the legislative unanimity that is needed for the EU to regulate things in taxation matters. Secondly, when it comes, we're still on the substantive challenges. When we come to the actors, to the people that is acting and performing this particular crimes, VAT fraud and corruption, practice seems to reveal that, and particularly in the very first sessions of the VIRTEU work, there were some claims according to which, and they are true, I agree with them, according to which multinationals have not been, at least they haven't been discovered engaged in tax fraud, in major tax fraud schemes. They have been discovered engaged in tax avoidance, which is different, and that conceptual difference is very important. That seems to have changed, and I'd like to stress the word seems due to the presumption of innocence, in a case in which involves new ways other than carousel fraud, for instance, investigated particularly in Italy, the Italy versus Booking.com case that involves the use of the reverse charge as a way of committing possibly, probably, we don't know, or presumably committing VAT fraud. The problem of enablers, as discussed by Professor Turkson, involves the balancing, and from the tax law perspective, while understanding the importance of curtailing the work of tax advisors in enhancing, in fostering VAT fraud and corruption, we understand that there's the need of adequate mechanisms of protection of taxpayers' rights and the market of legitimate tax advisors that provide tax advice, particularly having into account the fading border between the concepts of tax fraud and tax avoidance. And in that regard, it's particularly relevant the case law of the Court of Justice of the European Union in the Glencore case, when attributing responsibility to third parties not theoretically involved in the scheme, the tax fraud scheme, based on a normative approach. They knew or they should have known that the tax fraud was taking place. In the same sense, whistleblower protection, while important, we need to be, I raise the flag again, legality of evidence and taxpayer rights. We need to be careful if, in case we're eating the fruit of the poisonous tree and then polluting the investigation just by not controlling or by taking less controls on the legality of the evidence provided and the truthfulness of the evidence provided by whistleblowers. The problem of proportionality, I'm running out of time, so I would really like to go to my last slide, so I would just go over this. The non bis in idem conundrum, the thing of this approach for both the CJEU and the ECTHR, and not really enforcing non bis in idem, but creating this soft definition of non bis in idem that goes towards proportionality of multiple sanctions, administrative and criminal concurrently, instead of setting a stronger definition of non bis in idem, which goes pretty much in the sense of proportionality. And last but not least, from a criminological perspective, and I insist, I speak from the perspective of a tax lawyer who likes criminal tax law. So I beg for forgiveness to all those criminal law specialists that are listening to me right now, and I'm just crying out loud. What is this guy saying? First of all, the fraud triangle. Is the current system somehow fostering the fraud triangle? Is corporate, first of all, and these are more questions than answers in themselves. Is corporate criminal compliance enough to, so to speak, unnormalize tax crimes? Secondly, I will only take 15 more seconds, Donato, that would be it. Opportunity, does the system really block tax fraudsters, and particularly the mindset issue? There's still an issue on the perception of tax fraudsters of their own actions as unethical, as illegal. And on the other hand, and I will go right to the end of my slide, the policyfication of criminal tax law. Here we need to be aware of the risks, of the dangers of just going the other way around and unbalance the situation of protection of rights due to the protection of economic interests. And long story short, we need to be aware of the problem of creating the conditions for the criminal tax law system to become what Professor Jacobs in other contexts has called the enemy criminal law, Feinsteuerstrafrecht, or what Professor De La Feria from a tax perspective has called selective law enforcement. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Carlos, for your interesting presentation, perfectly on time, and it's well combined with the presentation of Professor Turksen on the challenges to counter corruption, tax fraud, a lot of interesting reflections, especially about the actors. Now we are the next contributor, that is Massimiliano Vincenti. Massimiliano holds degrees in economics and political sciences. In addition to being a lawyer and a chartered accountant, he is currently an investigator for the European Anti-Fraud Office of the European Commission in Brussels. And he had a long career. I can see commander of units in the Guardia di Finanza, several missions. So the title of Massimiliano's presentation is the European Anti-Fraud Role in Fighting Tax Fraud and Corruption, Challenges and Trends for the Future. Massimiliano, welcome to our panel, and many thanks. The floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Donato, and also many thanks to Professor Costantino Grasso, who invited me to this interesting conference and VIRTEU project. I have to say that since the project started 1 or 2 years ago, our landscape and environment completely changed. I'm talking about the European Anti-Fraud Office, that is an agency working for the Commission, but is at the same time independent from the Commission. It's clear that with the start of the operation of EPPO on the 1st of June 2021, we had to adapt. That is clear, because we have to find a way to cooperate and to live together with EPPO. And I'm very careful. I'm an investigator myself, so before doing anything, I always ask myself, is this something which is out of our competence? Is it EPPO's competence? Because the last thing that we want is to overlap or to step in someone else's courtyard. So just in a nutshell, OLAF organization we have two core activities, which is very important when it was designed in 1999. So we have the investigative part, two directorates. The investigations are related to EU staff, to the so-called centralized expenditure or expenditure in foreign external aid projects. We have units dealing with investigations concerning import duties and VAT import VAT. Other units are concerned more with smuggling of cigarettes and counterfeited goods. And then we have the core business, let's say, for units dealing with expenditure, EU funds, all type of EU funds, from maritime to agricultural to development project. The other main mission of OLAF is the policy making, and I think this is very interesting to have in the same organization someone who is operational and someone who can really take the best practices and try to let's say to foster new legislation, so new tools to deal with the same problem. So the policy making department is dealing with fraud prevention, with and external relations with the other authorities and entities, and also with projects and funding projects like Hercules, VIRTEU, or other. So normally I don't go through the whole process of investigation, but an OLAF investigation ends up with the issuing of a recommendation. Recommendation can be of four types. We have financial recommendations. These recommendations are addressed to Directorate General of the Commission, so the relevant one. Normally can be DG Agri, DG Mare, DG Regio, according to the type of funds which are involved. And the relevant Directorate General can decide to follow OLAF recommendation and ask for recovery to the member states, or justifying it, they can deviate from the recommendation. Then we have normally judicial recommendation. So that's when OLAF finds a crime during its investigation, and it will report before to the relevant national authority, now to EPPO, when we are talking about EU funds. Then the third type is disciplinary. Well, here it's clear, it's so-called detriment of the obligation, dereliction of the obligation of an EU member or EU staff in general, and the case is referred to the authority having disciplinary powers in the relevant EU institution. The last one, the last type of recommendation is the administrative. Administrative changes to procedures or legislation to prevent fraud being repeated with the same fraud scheme. So where is still the competence of OLAF now? Because In all jurisdiction, in all European jurisdiction, corruption is a crime. So normally crimes for us rings a bell, apple. And tax fraud again is a crime. So the competence of OLAF still, of course, is there for member states which did not take part in Apple. So the 5 member states that we've seen before. Then, of course, for it's called internal investigations, which deal with the EU stuff. And in this case, we talk about the dereliction of obligations stemming out from the functions of EU official, member of an institution, member of the EU Parliament, head of office or agency. And finally, in what are clearly disciplined in our regulation and in Apple regulation and in the framework agreement between the 2 institutions in the so-called support case or complementary investigation. So when we work under the guidance or in cooperation with the Apple. Where we really experience the link between the VAT frauds and tax crimes and corruption was, and I will go very briefly on it, it was the case of undervaluation of the goods coming from China and Southeast Asia. As you might know, the custom duties are calculated at import, normally ad valorem, so on the declared value of the goods. Easy to think the fraudsters under-declared the goods coming in, and they paid a percentage of a smaller value. Very easy. The tax fraud was not easy to be detected because, as you can imagine, the invoice, the bill of lading, the bank transactions, they all matched in a perfect way to report a value which is not in line with the market price. The tax crimes invoices are objectively fake, sometimes go along with the corruption of the customs officer who do not raise any reasonable doubt about the value of the imported goods. What was the added value that OLAF brought? The transnational approach. So we made studies, and it was really clear the pattern in the past. As soon as the customs authorities tightened the controls and escalated the measures against this phenomenon in a member state, the flow of understated goods immediately shifted to another member state. So that was, let's say, a school example of how important is the cooperation among OLAF, Europol, Eurojust, Apple, and also the national authorities.
Thank you for your excellent presentation. It is very interesting, your focus on the multiple roles of the OLAF from different perspectives, from the research to the investigation and cooperation with other EU and national institutions for the development of policies. Thanks for having also clarified it with reference to a case about corruption and transnational VAT fraud. Let's start with the Q&A question. First, I would like to ask if there is any question from the panelists of the conference. I think there is a question from Professor Turksen for Dr. Siko. Please, Umut, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Donato. Hi, Valeria. I was wondering if you have the information about the conviction rates and the sanctions imposed in the investigations you listed. So having so many investigations doesn't really tell me what the outcome was. So is that information available?
Yes, not at all, because we have an annual report that related until the 31st of December of last year. So we have only 6 months of operation. And from the annual report, I'm reading that we have all over the EPO countries just 5 indictments, conviction. But I don't know which is the sanction that were imposed, because I don't know which kind of sanction exists in every member state. But I know that EPO in the first 6 years seized 147 million of euro related to EU budget. So I think that the most important at the moment, because we are at the beginning and we can't arrive to a trial so easy, because we need to investigate, to deal with the evidence, the case. And for example, in Italy, we have almost 1 year and a half to investigate. So 6 months or 1 year is too not a long time to arrive in a trial. But I think the main important things is money that we seized until now.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
If there are many questions, I have one comment, but again, I'll wait my turn.
Yeah, please, if you have a comment, you can go on, and then
one important thing I think which touches upon some of the details that both Valeria and Carlos shared is, we're looking at criminal offenses and enablers and everything. But again, one thing we must be very, very careful about as criminal lawyers or anyone else is that there are people, and there will be more of them in the economic crisis, who are unable to pay their taxes, whatever the reason. So we're not just dealing with people or organizations which, from a career point of view, they are criminals, right? But there are an awful lot of people who, whatever the reason, they're not necessarily criminally minded, and they are not dishonest people, but they are unable to pay, or there is even an offense of failing to return your tax return on the date required. That's a criminal offense in Ireland. Okay, so we need to be careful how and if we criminalize people who fall under tax law or criminal law. There needs to be a real proportionate and real careful approach to what we criminalize. And then we haven't talked about the strict liability offense of failing to prevent tax evasion, for example, which exists in the statute books in the UK, a bit similar to failing to prevent money laundering. So we really need to look at innovatively how we create compliance, and I've given you several ideas about how we can achieve that. And one of them I forgot to mention is this very careful approach to what type of behavior we criminalize. And it was apparent that we look at the guilt in terms of a damage in numbers in tax crime, right? And I argue no, particularly if there is a fraudulent dishonesty involved, the damage is not just the money owed. Okay, damage goes beyond just what money was owed, and we shouldn't calculate the gravity of the offense based on what money was owed, tax liability. I think competition and other identifiable businesses which have been disadvantaged are very real victims. So we need to look at the damage of a crime from that, for a criminological point of view as well.
Thank you very much, Umut. I think the time is off, unfortunately, because we had some other received some other questions, but then I'm sure that we will share through email. Thank you very much, everyone, for your brilliant presentations, interesting questions. I really enjoyed a lot this session, and I'm sure that we will talk a lot about your thoughts in the next months. Given the time, I'm more than happy to give the floor to Dr. Grasso for the next session. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Donato, for moderating this panel. Thank you, Carlos, Umut, Massimiliano, and Valeria for the interesting presentations. I will pause the recording now, so we will have a break of 10 minutes, and then we will look at perspectives beyond Europe.